DCP Player free. Get it now from digital.net.au.
Hi, I'm back again. So I'm Annie Chang, and now I have my Disney hat on, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about IMF and Disney and ABC. So I'm actually glad Arjun actually looked before me, and then you'll hear more from Bill on how Sony's actually going to do that, how they actually are implementing IMF. And even though Disney has been a supporter of IMF from the very get-go, from the very beginning, I think it was my decision actually at Disney to try and have us hold off until the standards were actually very close to being done in order for us to try to not have to remake any packages. So now that the standards are done, we're in the process of testing and implementing the IMF. And so I'm just here to talk a little bit about what we're actually doing at the studio with our library and new titles. I'm going to talk a little bit about a package that some of you have actually heard about called NAB, and also what the Disney ABC Cable Networks groups are doing, and then some other IMF ideas that we're tossing around. But first, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of Disney's file-based history, which Howard covered a little bit, but I'll just touch on as well. So in 2005, I was actually working at a little company called THX, but I was helping Disney Disney Pixar put Cars onto DVD. And it was actually the first title that Disney had tried to do as a file-based workflow. What they did is Pixar actually outputted DPX frames. This was back in DVD days, so it was only NTSC and PAL. But we had DPXs on a DVS Pronto and used that as the sources for DVD. And it was actually a very interesting idea of trying to do this, and we found some really interesting ideas about the file-based workflow there with this, because the inserts, which I'll show you in a second, that you have for localized languages like Arjun was mentioning, if you just have just the instances of those and not have to have full-length versions of every language out there, you can save a lot of space. So then in 2006, I joined Disney, and as Howard mentioned, he and I actually went up to Pixar just to have a little file summit, because at the time all our HD masters were D5. We were going to switch over to HD CamSR, and I was hoping that maybe this was the time to actually switch over to some kind of magical file format. And Rick Sater up there, as Howard mentioned, said, why don't you do something like digital cinema? The light bulb went off, and said, yeah, that's a good idea. So we realized really quickly, though, that we weren't going to get very far just having a Disney proprietary format that was like a DCP for our non-theatrical masters, and so we started up this digital video package or DVP effort at the USC, ETC, and Fox and Sony and a few other studios all joined that effort. And so that led into the input into the SMPTE effort that occurred down in 2011, because it took us a little while, I think, at the ETC to argue about what exactly this file format was about. And of course, during this time between 2007 and 2011, life happened, and there was this proliferation of different master formats. We had all these different resolutions, we had HD, we had SD, and then we had all these downstream distributions that we actually had to deliver to. So then we ended up having a crazy amount of different file formats, and if any of you had seen one of my guys' presentation at HPA a couple of years ago, he actually calculated out all the different aspect ratios and resolutions and the different downstream distributions, and we actually ended up with 35,000 different files. So it was pretty ridiculous, and so we were trying to figure out, like, how could IMF actually look at this? In 2009, the standards effort still hadn't occurred yet, and we actually really wanted to get a file-based strategy at Disney in place, and so I kind of came up with this thing that was very similar to what we did in 2005. Turned out it was DPX frame sequences, and this time around in a DVS Clipster project. And we always had that strategy in mind that once the IMF standards were ready, we would take those DPX Clipster projects and convert them over to IMF. Then in 2010, June of 2010, we actually put that strategy into place, and our feature mastering went completely tapeless. And so that was actually a very interesting time, because we had a lot of back-end support for the files. Then in 2012, a little project called Disney Movies Anywhere came about, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And we also had a cleanup project called Project 800 up here, which ended up making more files. but still IMF was not ready. But now it's 2014 and we can actually start our conversion to IMF. So that's kind of the history there, and I'm going to talk a little bit first about these DPX Calypso projects, and then that kind of frames up the conversation for how we're using IMF. So I've got Bob Bagley back there with feature animation, and he'll be happy to know that I have like some inserts of Frozen here. So this is the main title card, and when I talk about the localized inserts, I'm talking about, for example, the main title of Frozen being translated into French and German. Feature animation and Pixar does up to 14 texted languages, and so you can imagine if we were to do that, plus the different aspect ratios, your masters start to increase quite a bit. So the idea here was just to store just the pieces that we actually need. So in our DPX Calypso projects, the idea here right now is that we have two different folders. We have one for the DPX sequence, one for the audio. DPX sequence contains an XML, it's called the Calypso project, the CP, and it contains all the full English and textless material. Then there's an audio folder that just contains the English audio, also the M&E as well, and we call that the English Calypso project. From that, we actually have a Calypso project that points to the different pieces to synchronize everything together, and then that turns into a, transcode out a ProRes QuickTime for servicing downstream, and that's full length. Then for any kind of another language, like a French version, we would have another set of folders with the French DPXs, but just the inserts for the French part, so like the main title, for example, for the Calypso project, and then also the French audio, just the 5.1 and the 2.0. The Calypso project points to the DPXs back from the English project, and then also the French inserts, and then also points to the French audio plus the NAB, for example, from the other package, and maybe the English 2.0. From that, we actually then generate a full-length ProRes file as well for servicing. So that's our current workflow right now, and that was actually always built up in mind in order for us to transfer over to the IMF. So in the IMF world, what ends up happening is we've actually decided, looking at the way the structure works, is that we'll actually end up having just one folder of deliverables for our English IMF, which basically contains all the JPEG 2000 files for the full text list. And we might actually break out the text as a little separate piece as well. But then have the English 5.1 and the M&E as part of the delivery as the English original version package or OV. We would still generate out the English ProRes for now until we have some more support for people taking IMFs directly. And then on the French, we would actually create a supplemental package, just like we do in Digital Similand, where you have a French CPL, there's the French inserts that point back to the English assets or Texas pieces, and then you have the French 5.1 and 2.0. And then from there, for now, we would create a ProRes QuickTime. So this is what we're actually in the process of implementing right now. So you might say, well, why would we do this? I mean, it's like DPX thing seems to be okay. Well, so just to give some comparisons, the DPX is for these three languages, English, French, and German, with just the insert pieces for French and German. Goes around 1.5 terabytes of size. It's kind of funny with me. Sorry, okay, it's a little funky on the display, but you can just look at the totals. That's what's important. For a lossless J2K IMF, which would be broadcast profile 7, we actually, it's interesting, these are real numbers. Frozen actually compressed really, really well from a lossless standpoint, and so with the three languages, it was just over 300 gigabytes, so it's awesome. But then if we decide to do a lossy J2K, something similar to a ProRes quality, it would get even smaller, and those three languages together end up being about 95 gigabytes. And then just in comparison, the ProRes QuickTimes each are about 135 gigabytes each, but because they are full-length files, we actually end up with about 405 gigs total for that. So you can see there's a lot of file savings going on with the IMF, and that's the reason why we're doing it. But wait, there's more. So as I mentioned earlier, in about 2012, there was a cleanup project called Project 800 that appeared, and it was really to just gather up all of the different assets and try and put them in one place so that we knew that these were conformed and clean, so it was like the audio, the subtitling. Leon's group has actually been instrumental in getting this all worked out, but it also included trailers and artwork. And then also we had this project called Disney Movies Anywhere that just launched last month, where you can get, it's a direct-to-consumer getting your movies from Disney. And so there were massive efforts basically to take all of our tape-based masters and convert them to something that they could then use for the Disney Movies Anywhere, or DMA. So what ended up happening is because IMF wasn't ready, there was a bunch of ProRes files that were created, and the Master Asset Collection, or MAC, was born. This was basically a project to reuse the existing ProRes files that were made for DMA and for the cleanup. They wanted an IMF structure, but this IMF wasn't ready at the time, so instead they basically created an IMF-like structure for it, and then they also included items that IMF wouldn't include, such as trailers and artwork. So just a real quick briefing on that. So the Master Asset Collection, included what's called a MAP, Master Asset Package, and that included just the picture, audio, subtitles, and proxies, so just the essence of the actual content. Whereas the MAC included the map, the trailer, key art, bonus material extras, and then some descriptive metadata. So the reason why I'm kind of bringing this up is just to explain like what our transition plan is here. So MAP is a hybrid format. It's IMF-ish, IMF-ish as we call it, and it does currently use ProRes QuickTimes, but it does have components and pieces like the inserts and the audio are separate. And then there was always an idea of converting to IMF when the standards are ready, and so we're actually in the process of getting ready for that. So on the studio side, just to summarize, we're about to do the conversion over to IMF, and Leon's Digital Studio is going to be instrumental in helping us do that internally. What we're doing right now is just confirming that the mastering systems that we're going to be using are making compliant IMFs, so we don't have to remake anything, and we're getting very, very close to getting there. And the Plug Fest obviously will be very helpful in May for that. So we're going to start the conversion this year. As for our new titles, we will change our mastering specifications to specify to use IMF instead of our DPX poster projects. And then our library titles, we have a whole bunch of DPXs in the inventory, and the idea is to take those and convert those over to IMF, where our storage guys will be super happy because they can finally get all their space back and all their DPXs. And then we're going to be converting some of the MAP ProRes files over to IMF, just depending on the title and what we have there. On the ABC side, because IMFs are not for features only anymore, we have been doing some testing with their episodic content because they also have the same problem. Specifically what we're looking at is their global self-servicing of their episodic content, and the goal of this test is really to prove out IMF as their new file format to replace what they're using now, which is ProRes QuickTime Masters. And they also are working on trying to update their MAM system to deal with the component-based assets for servicing, just like how Arjun has done it over at Fox. So we're doing some testing right now with 4 LA-based post houses. We have 3 phases. We have phase 1, which was just make a simple English IMF. And then phase 2 was to create non-English, so foreign language version masters of these. And phase 3 is basically then to have the 4 post houses take those files and interchange them, and then create something that they would normally create from a ProRes file, for example. So we're currently in phase 2. Everything's actually working really well. And the good thing about doing this testing is that we've had a lot of benefits. From a Disney perspective, we've been able to try and figure out, okay, so how are we actually going to master these things? And basically the same thing that you just heard from Arjun about how you actually create these components. Also for us, we're trying to figure out how we're actually going to store these things and access them. For the post houses, it's a great benefit because they're actually getting a chance to take a look and see, like, okay, how do I do this with IMF? Because it is a different file format from what they're used to doing, and you can have a lot of flexibility with it. And then also for us, from a delivery standpoint, it's giving us clarity on what we actually need to do for our specification for our master deliverables. For example, like we're figuring out, oh, maybe we should fill out the annotation text field in that CPL, because otherwise the HAM, or Human Asset Management, will be able to tell like what is what. So it's actually been pretty good going through this test. A couple other ideas that we've been tossing around at IMF, at Disney for IMF, is about the intelligent library. So it sounds like Arjun's got it figured out. I think Sony's also got it figured out, but we're still trying to get our MAM system to figure out how we're going to do this with IMF. There is a MAM system that Leon's group has that actually seems to be working just fine with it. So, you know, we'll just have to see how that works. Also, we're really looking at marketing materials as the next IMF implementation because there are so many different versions, especially when you have to deal with rough cuts and getting stuff to air. There's a lot of really interesting ideas about just using IMFs instead from a promo marketing standpoint for television. And then, of course, we're really interested because digital cinema packages are done upstream from IMF. Is there some way to maybe take the localized assets and CPLs and subtitling from DCPs and then be able to kind of start generating IMFs early on so that we can have assets ready sooner? So IMF is definitely in Disney's near future. But we do want more tool sets for IMF. So if there's any manufacturers out there, hear me now, because it's very important, I think, for us to have more editing capability and the ability to make more supplemental packages and that sort of thing. Also, MAM systems and transcoding would be great to have more support for IMF. And it would be great in the future, at some point, if color correction DI systems could then just generate JPEG 2000 files straight out of there. Or create IMFs directly, because that would actually make it a lot simpler. And instead, for now, we have to make DPXs and then make them JPEG 2000s. So that's my presentation.